y me da mucho gusto iniciar a tiempo esta segunda mesa sobre el tema del Acuerdo de Asociación Transpacífico, mejor conocido como TPP, y el Tratado Transatlántico de Comercio e Inversiones, TTIP. En esta mesa vamos a tener el gusto de recibir a distinguidas personalidades que vienen de diferentes rumbos. Voy a presentarlos por orden de exposición, cada quien en su turno. En primer lugar, tengo mucho gusto en dar la bienvenida a la profesora Meredith Kolsky, quien es profesora asociada y directora del Centro de Estudios Legales entre Canadá y Estados Unidos de la Escuela de Derecho SUNY Buffalo. Es también profesora asociada y directora asociada del Centro de Nueva Zelanda de Derechos de la Economía Internacional de la Escuela de Leyes Wellington de la Universidad Victoria. Fue profesora visitante de leyes en la Universidad de Georgetown. Sus investigaciones están orientadas al derecho económico internacional, especialmente a los acuerdos comerciales regionales y a la solución de controversias en la Organización Mundial de Comercio. La profesora Kolsky es vicepresidente coejecutiva y miembro fundadora de la Sociedad para el Derecho Económico Internacional. Entre sus publicaciones pueden destacarse con Sonny Frenkel, Derecho Económico Internacional y Autonomía Internacional, Acuerdos Comerciales en la Encrucijada, y con otros autores, Derecho Empresarial Internacional, esta última publicación por Oxford University Press. Los escritos de la profesora Meredith sobre las asociaciones transpacíficas incluyen el primer artículo que examina el tema expandiendo el Tratado P4 hacia una asociación transpacífica más amplia, implicaciones y oportunidades. Y tiene también otros textos sobre las implicaciones subsecuentes, tales como la sociedad transpacífica, nuevo paradigma o lobo en piel de oveja, desarrollo y TPPA, y hacia el logro de un área del Asia del Pacífico. ¿Presenta el TPP el más atractivo sendero? Tengo mucho gusto en dar la palabra a la profesora Meredith.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here, especially to Celia. I was so pleased to get this invitation. I've been looking forward to it very much, so thank you. In my presentation, I'm afraid I may go over some issues we have already heard about today because we have heard from very expert people thus far, but I'm going to give a bit of historical background to the TPP so we can understand how this agreement came to be, or the negotiations came to be, and what the original objectives were, so we can evaluate why countries like Mexico and Canada might have wanted to join it. And then I'm going to discuss some of the more unique aspects of the agreement, which could lead one to say that it's a new paradigm. And lastly, I'm going to highlight just some of the opportunities and implications raised by the agreement. So the TPP began with a totally different trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, or the P4 trade agreement. And this was a free trade agreement created amongst New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, and Brunei in 2005. And if you think about the world, you think about where those countries are, you think, why did they do that? That seems unusual. What were they thinking? They don't have a lot of trade with each other. And in fact, New Zealand and Singapore already had a free trade agreement, and Singapore and Chile already had a free trade agreement. Brunei is very tiny, so why did they decide to form a free trade agreement? Also, of course, it's unusual, or it was unusual in 2005, to have 4 countries in a free trade agreement. Most free trade agreements until very recently have been just 2 countries or maybe 3 countries. The idea behind the P4 was not primarily economic. So the idea was not necessarily to increase trade flows amongst those 4 geographically diverse countries, but instead they wanted to set an example. There had long been discussion at the idea level in APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, that one day there should be a free trade agreement of all of APEC, free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific. But it never got past this conceptual, we should do this, it would be a good idea stage. One of the impediments to any progress was a lack of agreement or will as to how to get it started. What would be the catalyst to create such an agreement? And so various models were suggested over time, including one which would have ASEAN, the ASEAN countries, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, lead the charge. They already had an FTA amongst themselves. They could expand it. Another was that a free trade agreement would be formed between China, Japan, and Korea, and we would have this East Asian FTA, and that would be the centerpiece that would grow into a larger Asia-Pacific-wide agreement. But these ideas didn't progress. And the P4 countries, particularly starting with New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, decided that they would like to come up with their idea of what this FTAP should look like. And so they said, why don't we negotiate what we think is the model agreement, the perfect agreement, and we will make it open for other countries to join if we agree to mutually agreeable terms. So the idea was to create a high standards agreement and to have it be comprehensive in terms of market access coverage, that there wouldn't be exclusions for agriculture, as we see in many free trade agreements, or textiles, as we see in many free trade agreements. So at this point, when you just look at this, you think, well, that looks kind of like NAFTA, doesn't it? High standards, no exclusions, open accession. That describes NAFTA. NAFTA is pretty unusual, even 20 years down the track. This was 15 years down the track. But the idea that the original countries had was not so different from NAFTA, right? Let's have an FTA that truly does cover all the trade, and let's encourage others to join in. And the idea was that if you have a pure agreement and you don't carve out and exclude, then you will create more market access opportunities that will be attractive, and other countries would want to join. So that agreement was negotiated, came into force in 2005. So how do we get from there to where we are now, to the TPP? Well, if we just read USTR's website, we would think that the US came up with the idea of the TPP on its own without any other precursor. But that's not quite the full story. What happened was, according to the terms of the P4 agreement, the initial agreement did not cover financial services or investment, but provided that 2 years after the agreement came into force, there would be new negotiations, additional negotiations to add financial services and investment to the P4. And at the time that was going to happen, someone in USTR, I've been told here who it was, but I don't have firsthand knowledge, so I'll just leave it general, I think quite brilliantly saw an opportunity and said, why don't we sit in on those negotiations? And they said, we'd like to sit in on your negotiations, and if we like what we see, then we'd like to become a part of this agreement. Now, let's just stop there and think about why the US, the person in USTR, might have thought this was a good idea. At this point, the US had an FTA with Singapore. The US had an FTA with Chile. The US had rejected New Zealand's overtures to have an FTA for 20 years or so. So it must have been Brunei, right? Was that chance to form the FTA with Brunei? Well, probably not, right? So there was something else going on. And just as the motivation for the P4 was not primarily economic in the first instance, I think that the US's motivation was more strategic to look at what could this become. And if you look at the history of the conceptualizations of free trade agreement of the Asia Pacific, all the other conceptualizations had two things in common. China was in, US was out. Okay, so here is now an opportunity to not be, as George Shultz once said, on the wrong side of a divided Pacific, right? Here's an opportunity for the US to be on the right side of the Pacific. And perhaps it's nice that China was not part of it, but I think the primary motivator was, let's get ourselves into it, right? Let's be a part of whatever this agreement is that has the potential to grow bigger and be part of setting the terms and be involved from the beginning. So kudos to USTR for recognizing that opportunity from my perspective. So I think that was really the motivation. As soon as the US said we'd like to sit in, somewhat unsurprisingly, other countries said, me too, me too, me too. And quite quickly, we then had the addition of Australia, Peru, Malaysia, Vietnam. And then, as you all know, in 2012, Canada and Mexico joined the negotiations. And then just last year, Japan. Now, interestingly, although the US asked to sit in on the negotiations back in 2007, the negotiations, the sort of group of countries sort of partially came together in 2008, but then of course the US had elections. And so there was everything was put on hold until the Obama administration could decide, was it going to pursue the same trade policy as the previous administration? That was in question. But ultimately, the Obama administration said, yes, we are going to proceed with the TPP. But thinking back to 2010, the middle of 2010, there was very little knowledge of this agreement, these negotiations. The countries that were involved were aware of it, and really beyond that, there was not a lot of awareness of it. I remember being at a conference and speaking with someone who had been in a high-level international position who's from Canada, had served in the Canadian government, and I said, why isn't Canada trying to join the TPP? What's going on with Canada? And she said, what's the TPP? And I explained, and she said, we're just focused on getting our FTA with Europe. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't matter to us. Okay. And then later that year, in November, President Obama spoke at the APEC summit in Hawaii, and that sort of seemed to be when the light bulb went off around the world and there was more awareness of it. But shortly after that, I was in China at a conference, and everyone there was in a frenzy about the TPP. What is this agreement? Is this designed to keep us out? What's going on? And it was just a little bit amusing because it had been kind of going on for a few years, but that was when people became more aware of it. As for whether the objective was to keep China out, I would say that there was a time when someone in USTR made a public statement along those lines, but that was quickly squashed. And certainly the other TPP partners vehemently rejected that notion. I think that the other countries' attitude has always been, if China wanted to agree to these terms, that would be fine. And shortly thereafter, USTR started saying more or less the same thing. But certainly in the first instance, it gives the US the opportunity to set these terms, and it's not a negative from the US perspective that China at present is not involved, right? So what makes this agreement special? Is it really a new paradigm? Is it just like NAFTA, or do we have something kind of different here? Well, if we think historically, most FTAs bilateral, NAFTA was trilateral. For the ones that weren't bilateral, I can't think of any example other than the P4 of an agreement that wasn't strictly regional. So NAFTA, 3 countries all connected, ASEAN, countries all in a tight region. And if we think about what countries linked together in the past, while NAFTA was an example at the time, one of the first, perhaps the first example of a developed country linking with a developing country, that has become sort of normal. And what we haven't seen is 2 really big economies joining, right? There is no FTA between China and Japan, or Japan and the US, or China and the US, so on, right? And historically, with NAFTA as an exception, most FTAs have not been all that ambitious. The coverage has basically been tracking the WTO, trying to carve out some sensitive areas, but not necessarily trying to be the term setter for the future, right? The US agreements have had their own template, which have provisions that go beyond the WTO, but oftentimes the US agreements also carve out things that the US considers sensitive, so they haven't been pure. In the TPP, all of these aspects, it's different with respect to all of these things. Of course, the number of parties, unprecedented. We have 12 countries right now negotiating this agreement. In terms of those countries, they're not all neighbors. While they're broadly in the Pacific, we have both sides of the Pacific represented, and we have countries that are not right on the ocean on both sides. So we have a wide geographic reach. The size of the economies. When it was just the original 9, it seemed sort of like the US and a bunch of small countries. But the addition of Japan really changes that equation. You now have 2 of the top 3 largest economies of the world in the same agreement. That is new and different. The scope is quite ambitious. If the P4 model is followed through, then there won't be any categorical product exclusions. Presumably there will be some fudging around the margins for very sensitive products, but as far as I've heard, there isn't any agreement that there should be a wholesale exclusion of any product. And there are many new topics that go well beyond the coverage of NAFTA. So Some people call these the 21st century issues. Some people might call it upgrading. But there aren't trade agreements thus far that cover things like regulatory coherence and small and medium enterprise provisions and state-owned enterprise provisions. A lot of focus on behind-the-border cooperation types of issues. So that all seems rather different. And already the TPP has sparked somewhat of a paradigm shift. Since the TPP negotiations began, we now also have TTIP under negotiation. So now we have two other big superpowers negotiating an FTA. There was never that before. In the context of Asia, which John is going to talk about, there's now a big FTA negotiation, the RCEP, which includes all the ASEAN countries, plus Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, India. When all those linkages happen, that combines lots of economies that haven't been combined before. So if that gets concluded, there will be a China-Japan linkage, there will be a Japan-Korea linkage, there will be a China-Korea linkage. None of that has been really attempted before. And TTIP, of course, also has a very ambitious agenda, picking up on many of the sorts of non-tariff barrier issues that are being covered by the TPP. So if we just look at the current landscape, maybe it looks not so different from everything else, but I think this is what sparked many of these other developments. So is the TPP really going to expand further, or is it just going to be this kind of anomalous, strange agreement? Well, it does seem, I do think that Japan joining was a significant development, because before that, it was rather imbalanced with the US and then economies that were significantly smaller. But now that Japan has come in, Korea is now more interested in coming in. Before, Korea said, quite rightly, well, the US actually hasn't implemented the US-Korea FTA yet, so we're not about to try to negotiate another FTA with you yet. So they were sort of taking a wait-and-see approach. And the idea of China, just 2 or 3 years ago, laughable, the idea of China joining. China was thinking this is an anti-China agreement and very defensive about it. Some voices in the US were sort of saying, well, of course it's an anti-China agreement. And then, lo and behold, last year, China floats this kind of trial balloon where this MOFCOM official makes this statement about, well, we're studying it, we'd look at it, we'd consider it. And that was really interesting and somewhat surprising. And while at one level we might think, well, really, would that happen? Actually, China is pretty pragmatic. And the WTO accession process enabled China to make very significant changes to its regulatory structure that I think the government thought was a wise thing to do and a necessary thing to do, and the WTO process enabled it. And I think if you're China and you're looking at this agreement, you think, this may be the terms of the future, and we're going to have to get used to them, so maybe we should try to get into it before we lose too much ground relative to our competitors. And China is now an IP creator as well as an IP consumer. So agreeing to these heightened intellectual property provisions may not seem as unrealistic as it did even a few years ago. As John will talk about, China is sort of spearheading or is significantly involved in negotiating its own mega FTA now. But again, China is looking at the TPP. So I don't think the RCEP myself is really on the same level as the TPP. It's more of a bog standard FTA from my perspective. John can disagree with that. But we'll have to see. So what does the future hold? Well, I think the TPP has a better chance than the RCEP of expanding. As was discussed earlier, there's already a line of countries that has signaled an interest in joining the TPP. In addition to the ones discussed, Taiwan would like to get in, other countries that would like to get in. In terms of implications and why this is probably a good idea for Mexico and Canada to be a part of, the TPP has real potential to be the agenda center for the future. Probably some of these new issues that are being covered in the TPP will be on the WTO agenda in the future, or will at least be promoted in other FTAs. But there's a ways to go between where we are now and where we need to go. As has been discussed, Trade Promotion Authority remains a question mark, and while it was very exciting for Japan to come into the agreement, you know, those of us who have watched Japan and trade for many years, you'll believe it when you see it as to how far down they're going to go in their market access commitments. But I'll just leave it there and take your questions later. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Meredith Kolsky por este interesante panorama que nos ha presentado del TPP. Y ahora tengo mucho gusto en dar la bienvenida al profesor John Ravenhill, quien nos va a hablar sobre el TPP, la Asociación Regional Económica Integral, el RCEP, y el futuro de la integración económica en Asia. El profesor John Ravenhill es director de la Escuela Vasily de Asuntos Internacionales y profesor del Departamento de Ciencia Política en la Universidad de Waterloo. Fue previamente director de la Escuela de Política y Relaciones Internacionales en la Escuela de Investigación de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad Nacional Australiana y tuvo la cátedra de Política en la Universidad de Edimburgo. Recibió su doctorado en la Universidad de California en Berkeley y sus maestrías en las universidades de Indiana y Dalhousie. Ha publicado en algunas de las revistas más reconocidas en relaciones internacionales, incluidas International Organization, World Politics, Review of International Political Economy y la Review of International Studies. Durante 2 décadas coeditó con James Cotton una serie de libros en el Instituto Australiano de Relaciones Internacionales denominada Australia in World Affairs. Su último libro, coeditado con Andrew McIntyre y T.J. Pemple, es Crisis as Catalyst, Asia's Dynamic Political Economy, editado por la Universidad de Cornell. Recientemente editó junto con Sadia Pekkanen y Rosemary Foote el Oxford Handbook for the International Relations in East Asia. Es editor del texto de la Oxford University Press, Economía Política Global. Actualmente está por terminar un libro sobre la industria automotriz en el este de Asia y sigue trabajando en la producción de redes y acuerdos comerciales en la región Asia-Pacífico. Cedo la palabra al profesor John Ravenhill.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to be invited to this important workshop and delighted to have this opportunity to visit the college, and special thanks to Celia Toro for the invitation. We've heard a lot about the TPP so far today, but for East Asia, the TPP is not the only game in town. Indeed, for the majority of Asian states, it's not even on the table currently. Even a long-standing US ally, the Philippines, was rebuffed by Washington when it sought to enter the negotiations a few months ago. So only 4 Asian countries are currently participating. As we heard this morning, the TPP is currently very much dominated by NAFTA. So the focus in my presentation is primarily on the so-called Asian alternative, a grouping that has this rather convoluted, I think awful name. It sounds like it was designed by a committee. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, commonly referred to as RCEP. Now, I mean, my figuring on this is that it would actually be much better English to call it the Comprehensive Regional Economic Partnership. But if you think about the initials for that, it's rather too uncomfortably close to a word that's not polite in the English language. And so that may have something to do with the choice of terminology. I'm going to take a broad perspective. Think about that for a while. Take a broad perspective in trying to place RCEP in context. And for me, the starting point on this, if I can find the, that's it? Yeah, right, thanks. The starting point here is really to see the RCEP as the latest development in a long-standing debate over the nature of the region as far as Asia is concerned. Should this be East Asia or should it be Asia Pacific? What I want to try to address in this presentation is how viable an alternative the RCEP is to the TPP. Is it a complementary agreement? But first, who's in it and what is this thing? As Meredith said, RCEP grows out of the series of FTAs that ASEAN has negotiated with various partners. The so-called +3 countries, China, Korea, South Korea that is, and Japan, with India, and with Australia and New Zealand through linking up the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement with the Australia-New Zealand. It's the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. It's another tongue twister, and CETA. So within the negotiations for RCEP, you have 16 countries currently. Of course, I think after this morning, everyone is familiar with the TPP. It's a very different map that comes into play, looking at TPP membership and the 12 countries that are currently in the negotiations. If one looks at which countries are in both, then you see a relatively small list. And this gives you the list of Asian countries that are currently involved in the TPP negotiations: Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, and Japan. Now, of course, if you take Japan out of it, then these are all pretty small economies. Vietnam is a potential exception to this. It's got a large population, but of course very low per capita income at the present time. Vietnam will be an important player in the future, but the others are really small. So of the large Asian economies, only Japan is currently in the TPP. There's no China, there's no South Korea, and there's no Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, never gets a mention. I don't think Taiwan was mentioned once this morning, even though New Zealand now has an FTA with Taiwan. So it is starting to become much more of a player in FTAs beyond the rather silly agreements it has with Central American countries. So where does this all fit in the history of Asian regionalism? Well, I want to focus my remarks around three themes here. The first is this quest for an East Asian identity. The second is the long-standing and ongoing desire of ASEAN to be at the center of regionalism in that part of the world, and then to link this to a third set of issues, geopolitical considerations. If we start with an East Asian identity, I'm sure many of you are aware that East Asia is really a very modern invention. People used to talk about Southeast Asia as a region. Some people talked about East Asia in terms of the countries of Confucian heritage. This used to be the Harvard approach to East Asia. But no one really started to talk about East Asia, that is, as a region comprising Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, until the late 1980s. And a lot of this has to do with the energetic proposals from the Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir, at the time of APEC's establishment, to create an East Asian economic grouping. This didn't materialize, in large part because of concerns from the Northeast Asian countries, but these were certainly also reinforced by concerns expressed by the United States. And Secretary of State Baker was very active in lobbying the Japanese government to reject the Malaysian proposal. But within a decade, an East Asian Economic Caucus, which was originally set up as part of APEC, became a much more significant entity, in part as a consequence of the establishment of a dialogue between Asian countries and the European Union, ASEM, as it's called. And having to coordinate a position to negotiate with the European Union brought the East Asians together as ASEAN +3, a leaders' meeting. Now, this was subsequently institutionalized in 1999, in part in response to the Asian financial crises that had afflicted the region in the previous 2 years. Another important step in this was Japan's efforts at the time of the financial crisis to create an Asian monetary fund. Again, initially, this didn't fly. But within 5 years, it did get off the ground in the form of the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is essentially a pool of reserve funds which can be used to bail out countries experiencing foreign exchange difficulties. At the same time as this was going on, immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, the then Korean president, Kim Dae-jung, proposed the establishment of an eminent persons group called the East Asian Vision Group. And he also, at that time, proposed an ASEAN +3 free trade agreement. ASEAN, Japan, China, and Korea. The FTA proposal went nowhere, but the East Asia Vision Group did. It reported in 2001, and the theme throughout the report was essentially using closer economic cooperation to drive the institutionalization of an East Asian grouping. It proposed the eventual creation of an East Asia economic community. And cooperation would be institutionalized through an East Asia summit. But this is where things get very interesting, because events took a very different track to those that the group originally anticipated. The proposed East Asia summit became embroiled in divisions between Japan and China as to what form of economic cooperation should be pursued. China wanted an East Asia-only grouping, that is ASEAN +3. Japan wanted a comprehensive economic partnership that would involve not just ASEAN +3, but also Australia, New Zealand, and India. And this was ultimately decided at a meeting of the ASEAN +3 group, and it was largely the result of one person, and that was the Indonesian president, Susulu Bambang Yudhoyono, who, against the advice of his foreign ministry, decided to go with the Japanese proposal rather than with the Chinese. And so invitations then went out to Australia, New Zealand, and India to participate in the forthcoming East Asia Summit, which left it as a very different entity to that which was originally imagined. The ASEAN foreign ministers then said, anyone can participate in the East Asia Summit if they're a dialogue partner of ASEAN, if they have substantial ties to the ASEAN region, and if they are willing to sign on to ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And this led in 2011 to a further broadening of the summit, with Russia and the United States becoming parties to it. So one then arrives at an East Asia Summit, which is very, very different. Membership broadened well beyond East Asia. A summit which has substantially removed ASEAN from a central role. At the same time, economic issues were being pursued elsewhere rather than primarily within the East Asia Summit, APEC, and of course the early stages of the TPP negotiations. So the East Asia Summit instead became primarily a vehicle for discussing security and broader political issues, very much realizing the ill-fated proposal that Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd put forward for an Asia-Pacific community, a body whose primary focus would be on security issues. But it certainly wasn't any longer a vehicle that was going to primarily enhance East Asian identity. And it also fundamentally undermined ASEAN's attempts to be at the heart of any negotiations for regionalism. So this then links into the second theme about ASEAN centrality. If one goes back again to the establishment of APEC, you see ASEAN resistance to APEC. Eventually ASEAN agreed to APEC on the understanding that every other APEC leaders meeting would be held in an ASEAN capital. That no longer actually occurs, but that was the original understanding. It's always been very convenient for China and Japan to give ASEAN at least a nominal role, a nominal leadership role in East Asian regionalism, not to be themselves perceived to be the ones pushing a particular agenda. ASEAN, of course, is the longest standing regional grouping in that part of the world. It was founded in 1967. Its first half century is coming to a close fairly soon. And it does regard itself as the most important actor. So one can see the proposal for a regional comprehensive economic partnership, RCEP, as a response in part to ASEAN marginalization. It came from within ASEAN itself. The TPP is a direct threat to ASEAN. Only 4 ASEAN members, 4 out of 10 ASEAN members are involved in the TPP negotiations. So it splits ASEAN. The RCEP proposal was initiated at the first meeting between ASEAN economic ministers plus ASEAN FTA partners. Now, again, this was a rather strange meeting because it followed on from the first meeting of the East Asia Summit economic ministers. So both Russia and the United States were involved in that meeting. But then they were pushed out, and a separate meeting held with the partners that currently had free trade agreements with ASEAN. ASEAN plus 3, plus India, plus Australia, New Zealand. The negotiating guidelines that were adopted at the first meeting of the RCEP Trade Negotiations Committee give you some key clues as to the agenda here. They state explicitly that, I've gone too far, sorry, let's take that one back. Negotiations will recognize ASEAN centrality in the emerging regional economic architecture. They also, very importantly, emphasize a principle that is central to ASEAN economic integration, and that is that any agreement has to recognize the diversity of the region and must include substantial flexibility in its provisions, including, of course, special and differential treatment for the least developed. So, substantially different approach to that within the TPP. Flexibility, special and differential treatment. Now, how attractive then is this as an alternative to the TPP? What are the problems with this? What's the problem with an ASEAN-centered approach? Well, the first set of problems relate to ASEAN itself. It really is too small to have the resources to play a leadership role. If you actually look at the various initiatives, the major initiatives that have been taken in the region, that is ASEAN plus 3, over the last 15 or so years, they've all been driven by the plus 3 countries, by China, by Japan, or Korea. ASEAN itself has played a minimal role in driving things forward. ASEAN itself is very divided, and when one tries to get an agreement on anything to do with economics in ASEAN, it's very difficult to go beyond a lowest common denominator approach, which is typically that proposal favored by the least developed of the ASEAN countries, the Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar grouping. Thirdly, ASEAN's agreements tend to be expressed as aspirations rather than as legally binding commitments. And there's a long-standing joke that the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, the initials for that, stand for agree first, talk after. And so you find that ASEAN treaties tend to have 3 or 4 pages in them with broad agreement on let's do something on this. And then the parties have to go away and decide what, if anything, they're going to do about it. A very recent example of this, something that was published last week, a little newspaper article by the former ASEAN Secretary General, Rodolfo Severino. And basically he was responding to criticisms that the latest of the ASEAN aspirational targets, that is to create an ASEAN economic community by 2015, that this is just not going to happen. There are key areas where the agreements are not going to be implemented. And his response to this, well, one shouldn't judge us by the actual details, the literal rendering of the specific measures that we've agreed to. We should be judged by the aspirations that we have. And this is another aspiration. It's a good thing. But don't hold us accountable for what we've actually said we're going to do. And this carries forward into the negotiations for RCEP. Now, an approach emphasizing flexibility, informality, may have certain advantages, may be attractive. And certainly that's been the case if one sees the primary purpose of these economic agreements to actually be political or strategic in purpose. So that China was quite happy to sign on to a very, very superficial trade agreement with ASEAN because it was a big political gain for China to get this agreement, especially before Japan got one. They can also be useful in building confidence, and this, many people would say, has been one of the primary contributions of ASEAN, to build confidence amongst its members. It could be politically attractive. Flexibility, you don't have to make those politically painful domestic adjustments to implement these legally binding clauses in other arrangements. So ASEAN-type agreements do have their attractions sometimes. But I think what one is seeing in the region is increasing impatience on the part of Japan and Korea with the ASEAN approach, and their desire, now that they have a number of FTAs and, of course, significant interests in intellectual property, etc., they want a more serious WTO plus agreement. So I don't think the RCEP, unless it goes far beyond what's envisaged, is going to be all that attractive to Japan and Korea. Historically, they've been very wary, and Meredith mentioned this. I mean, there still is, of course, no Northeast Asian free trade agreement. They've been very wary about entering negotiations with China. Well, Korea currently is negotiating with China, so it will be interesting to see what comes out of that. Korea's always been worried about agriculture. It's been worried about its small and medium enterprises. It's worried about intellectual property as well. But Japan at the moment has no interest whatsoever in a bilateral FTA with China. And this then leads into the final factor that I want to emphasize, and that is the issue of geopolitical rivalry. Over the years, the Japan-China rivalry has really defined the approach to regionalism. And only very rarely have modern Japanese governments seen their destiny as lying primarily in East Asia. There's one significant exception to this, and that was Prime Minister Hatayama in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis. He proposed a significant reorientation of Japanese foreign policy to a focus on East Asia. He was very critical of the United States, as of course was China at the time, very critical of the IMF for responding much more leniently to the crises in Europe than the IMF had responded to in the crises in Asia a decade before. And so there may, at this time, have been this very narrow window of opportunity to focus integration on East Asia. But then geopolitics intervened again. China essentially shot itself in the foot by becoming increasingly aggressive on territorial issues, especially in relation to the South China Sea. And so whereas in 2009, 2010, China's stocks were riding very high in the region, very quickly this was reversed. And there was increasing concern about China's assertiveness. I mean, here one of the things that struck me in our discussions today, and I've been guilty of this here as well, we're talking about countries all the time. We're talking about China this or the United States that. We need to step back at times and acknowledge the diversity of interests that there are, different bureaucracies. And so it could well be that in China, over this period, one saw quite different interests between economic ministries and defense ministries, but the government wasn't able to keep the military under control in this period. And this has, for the foreseeable future, undermined any prospects of a Chinese-led economic regionalism. So, to finish up, brief comparison of the two agreements. TPP, of course, is bigger in terms of global GDP, share of global GDP. The RCEP countries are growing much more rapidly than TPP countries. The RCEP countries are not insignificant. It's a large group of relatively rapidly growing economies. There is potential there in forging a credible trade agreement. Services have been largely ignored in the ASEAN +1 agreements, and so that's an obvious area. Rules of origin could be harmonized. I mean, this is actually an area in which ASEAN traditionally has had a very liberal approach, and it wouldn't be too difficult to harmonize those across the agreements. So there's some potential there. But I'm not optimistic, given ASEAN's general approach and its demand to be at the center of these arrangements, that we will see a very significant agreement coming out of it. I'm not a big fan of speculation, but to take a little risk here, I do think that in the not too distant future, RCEP will come into being. It may even come into being before the TPP. It's still symbolic. It's impossible for Japan, the Japanese government, or the Korean government, or the Chinese government to go against the idea of having an East Asian grouping. It has symbolic importance. And this agreement may be easier to negotiate simply because it is less demanding. It's likely to be more reliant on aspirational language, however, than on legally binding commitments. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Ravenhill, por este panorama que nos presenta con todas las implicaciones y los desafíos para este acuerdo de asociación. Me toca ahora dar la palabra al profesor Thomas Bollyky, quien nos va a hablar de la búsqueda de la coherencia regulatoria dentro del Tratado Transatlántico de Comercio e Inversiones. El señor Bollyky es Senior Fellow para la Salud, la Economía y el Desarrollo en el Consejo de Relaciones Exteriores y es también profesor adjunto de Derecho en la Universidad de Georgetown y consultor de la Fundación Bill and Melinda Gates. Previamente fue Fellow en el Centro para el Desarrollo Global y director de la Propiedad Intelectual y la Innovación en la Office of U.S. Trade Representative, donde condujo las negociaciones para las tecnologías farmacéuticas, biotecnológicas y médicas en el Tratado Comercial entre Estados Unidos y la República de Corea, y representó a este tratado en las negociaciones con China en lo que concierne a la seguridad en las importaciones de alimentos y medicinas. Fue también Fulbright Scholar para Sudáfrica. Sus más recientes trabajos se han publicado en el New York Times, en Science, Foreign Affairs, Journal of American Medical Association, The Atlantic y en el Stanford Journal for Law and Policy. Es miembro del Comité Consultivo de la Clinton Global Initiative y fue consejero legal en la Organización Mundial de la Salud. El señor Bollyky recibió su maestría en Biología en la Universidad de Columbia y su JD en la Escuela de Leyes de la Universidad de Stanford, donde fue presidente de la Revista de Leyes y Política de Stanford. En 2013, el Foro Económico Mundial lo nombró como uno de sus líderes. El señor Bollyky es miembro de la Suprema Corte de Nueva York y de Estados Unidos y de la American Society of International Law. Dejo con ustedes al señor Bollyky.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm grateful to Celia for the invitation to participate in this meeting. I'm also grateful to all of you. You've sat through a long day of discussion of trade and a whole variety of trade agreements, and I'm Grateful to you for sticking it out. I'm here to talk about the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. There are many interesting issues and controversies involving this agreement. How data protection will be resolved in the wake of the Snowden revelations, what the EU will do on investor-state dispute resolution when they go to public consultation, how that public consultation will work out. There's the whole question of its geopolitical effects and whether and how it should involve Mexico and Canada, and I will talk about none of those things. I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A session, but I'm actually going to focus my remarks just on one area, which is the push for regulatory convergence in the agreement. My remarks will come in four broad parts. I'm going to talk a bit about what are the reasons underlying this push on regulatory convergence in this negotiation, what its potential benefits might be for the U.S. and Europe's competitiveness. I'm going to outline a broad strategy of a way to make progress in these talks, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where these talks now are on this issue, although keep in mind they are very, very early days. The reason why I'm focusing on regulatory convergence is that, as you will see when we proceed, this is by far and away the most important issue economically in these talks. I also think it's the future of trade. How this issue is resolved in the TTIP talks will have everything to do with what moves forward in the WTO in the future and how regional trade agreements look in general, and we'll discuss why. So why do people care about regulation in the TTIP talks? As was mentioned this morning, this is a massive deal. Just the economic states are huge. Between the US and the European Union, that represents nearly half of the world's GDP, 1/3 of the world's trade in goods and services, and $3.6 trillion in bilateral direct investment. Those are enormous stakes. It is the largest regional trade, it will be the largest regional trade agreement ever done. It was announced in the State of the Union. We have gone through now 3 rounds. There will be a 4th finally in March. The EU had been pushing for this to be concluded in advance of when its new parliament would sit in November 2014. As my colleague Jeff Schott correctly pointed out, that will never happen. But that had been the timeline which people have been talking about for these negotiations. So these economies are huge, but the potential for the traditional, getting trade gains from the traditional focus of trade agreements, tariffs, is really quite limited in this case. Because the economies are so large, it's real money. Between the two, one recent study showed that tariff elimination would boost potentially EU tariffs by $28 billion, and boost U.S. EU exports by $28 billion, and U.S. exports by $23 billion. But ultimately, you're talking about an average tariff rate for the U.S. of 3%, and an average tariff rate for the EU of 5%. These are relatively low, and it's only because the trade is so large and these economies are so large that the benefits are as significant as they are. That said, there are economic gains to be had in this negotiation. The United Kingdom's Centro for Economic Policy Research estimates that as much as 80% of the gains from these talks will depend on reducing the conflicts and unnecessary conflicts and duplication that exists between EU and US rules on ranging from food safety to automobile parts. The benefits without these, without making progress in this area, obviously will be somewhat limited. So that's the reason why it's been a focus in these talks. There's lots of reason to be pessimistic about the success of talks in this area, though. As was mentioned this morning, this is a difficult political environment in trade in both the U.S. and Europe. The push for Trade Promotion Authority or fast track in the U.S. has not been auspicious for the political reception for trade initiatives in the future. Europe has had its own challenges in terms of its parliament and the views that have been expressed around these talks. So it's a difficult political environment. More specifically on regulation, there have been, depending on how you count them, between 8 to 10 initiatives, transatlantic initiatives on improving regulatory cooperation or reducing differences just since the Clinton administration. So this is not the first time this has been tried. There are, of course, also very deep cultural differences between these two, between consumers of these countries around consumer safety, environmental protection, and privacy. There are also real differences in how regulation in many areas occurs, namely in the European context, and depending on the area you're referring to, many have adopted a precautionary principle in which goods need to be proven to be safe. U.S. Tends to take the opposite approach, that there needs to be signs, again, speaking very broadly, there needs to be a sign of lack of safety for a concern to arise. That said, I think there are reasons for optimism, and they have to do with changes in the international trading system and the role of regulation as a result. Increasingly, goods and services do not come from just one place. Cheaper shipping, improvements in information communication technology, and lower tariffs have allowed companies to unbundle and source stages of production to specialist suppliers and intermediate service providers around the world. These global supply chains now dominate international commerce with the, that's still not me. With intermediate inputs now comprise 56% of the global trade in goods and 73% of the global trade in services. This has three implications for what's going on in the TTIP rather, on regulation. The first is that regulation is more important in trade in general. With parts and services in these global supply chains crisscrossing borders multiple times, global supply chains now increasingly depend on the adequacy, predictability, and efficiency of regulatory oversight in all the countries involved. That's the first implication. The second implication is the days in which the US and the European Union can dictate global regulation and international standards are numbered. Many people assume in international trade that there is a race to the bottom, that countries will compete for having the lowest regulations in order to get investment and be able to do manufacturing. In fact, you see the exact opposite. What you see generally is a race to the top. And the race to the top is to try to meet the standards of the largest, most affluent consumer market that is the most stringently regulated. And the reason for that is you don't want to run several different production lines if you can. For most manufacturing and most production, most even service provision, you'd like to do everything the same way. It's more efficient. That leads to what people have referred to as the California effect and the Brussels effect. Forgive the Brussels picture, but it is the landmark everybody knows in Brussels. So the California effect comes from the notion that California's more stringent auto emission standards ended up driving the US standard and to some degree international standards, because the California market is so large that auto manufacturers didn't want to run several different production lines. They just simply transitioned altogether. You see similar effects for the European Union on competition rules, on privacy, where global standards have moved to meet the Europeans' approach to this issue. This ability to do this, though, is fading. It is fading because other economies are growing, which is good news, but so are their consumer populations. And the weight that the consumer market in the US and Europe hold is no longer what it once was. So their ability to project those standards down these supply chains is more limited. There's also been a propensity for the US and Europe not to agree. And for those of you that have read Dan Densner's great book, All Politics Are Global, when you really look at standards around food safety, different international standards, it's really when the US and Europe have agreed that they've been able to establish the international standards in these areas. When they don't, they compete over countries to adopt their different approaches. So their ability to go it alone and set these standards is more limited. That's the second consequence of the change in the way international trade works. The third is that regulators and trade officials now need one another. Given the scale and complexity of global supply chains, EU and US regulators simply cannot fulfill their mandates by going it alone. To give one example, the US Food and Drug Administration's the imports they regulate quadrupled in a decade, from 6 million to 24 million shipments. They now involve 300,000 facilities in 150 different countries. The US FDA cannot fulfill its mandate in terms of products coming into market. There are legal and practical limits to inspecting such a multitude of producers and suppliers. Regulators cannot make progress without the trade folks. The high globally compatible standards that they seek will only be adopted if they are in the economic interests of the exporting countries involved. Similarly, regulatory dialogues, and there have been many of those even outside of the trade context, do not succeed without the structure, the incentives, the linkage, and the high-level political commitment that comes with trade talks. Conversely, trade officials cannot make progress without regulators. I know this from painful experience at USTR with my regulatory counterparts, both on the food side and on the medical side, that you can have high-level political commitment and it will resolve one-off disputes, but it will not achieve the consistent regulatory interpretations and predictable enforcement that you need to support international commerce. That can only come if the regulators are actually invested in the outcome. They will simply wait you out. They will show up, people will be very polite, and you will achieve nothing. So what is the prescription for moving forward with that grim summary? Currently, there's been a lot of focus on adopting procedures on both sides. Both the European Union and the US have talked about transparency, notice, and the ability to comment as a way of making forward or one of the ways to make progress in this area. And I do think that will be helpful, but not sufficient in that case. You need, I'm a believer in incentives in international trade negotiation, and you need to engage in areas where there are overlapping interests on trade and regulation. Where do those occur? When there are third-party effects of having both the European Union and the US taking the same approach to a regulatory problem. There are 800 million consumers between them. Again, they represent nearly half of the world's global economy. You have the US and Europe adopt the same regulatory approach, the same international standard. Other countries, as we talked about with the California effect and the Brussels effects, end up adopting them as well. The other areas to make progress are work sharing. As we've mentioned before, just using the US FDA as an example, they cannot do their job alone. You need to have coordination, sharing of inspection duties, sharing of inspection reports with other regulatory authorities. The third area is new regulations. There's a comment this morning about when the areas in which the EU has made progress on regulation. There actually have been many of them. They have not arrived generally from mutual recognition, though. Where they have arrived or developed from are new areas of regulation that countries can cooperate together on. To give an example, the European Medical Agency adopted a single pathway for drug registration. It was initially only for innovative biotech products. It is now the dominant way drugs are registered in Europe. It saved 40% of the time and cost of registering in every country. This has happened in multiple other areas as well, clinical trial regulation. It is in the areas in which you have a difficult to solve problems, and the ability of countries to working together to solve them has both regulatory benefits and commercial benefits. So what do you need? You need a structured, sector-specific, regulator-driven approach. So by structured and sector-specific, it means there is a whole range of activities one can do to make progress on reducing regulatory divergence, whether that is adopting international standards, we talked about regulatory cooperation, mutual recognition, equivalence, even harmonization, although that is a graveyard for a lot of good intentions in international trade, but even harmonization is one of the tools. It depends on the area that you're trying to address. A 2009 study that showed that in terms of the transatlantic relationship, that 75% of potential economic benefits of regulatory convergence occur in the following 4 sectors: motor vehicles, chemical, cosmetics, and pharmaceuticals, food and beverages, electrical machinery, including medical devices. Those are your 4 big areas where divergence currently has the greatest economic effect. The last is monitor and publicly available results. So there is, and we talked a little bit about this morning, the notion of binding dispute resolution in U.S. trade agreements. Binding dispute resolutions on regulatory convergence provisions will result in very unambitious regulatory convergence work plan and provisions. An alternative approach has been adopted by the Australians and between the trans-Tasmanian relationship, Australia and New Zealand, has been having a public work plan and releasing the results of progress made on that work plan as a way of trying to prod progress instead of having dispute resolution. And there's good sense there, particularly in dealing with skittish regulatory authorities. So where are we now? The focus in the talks to date, there has been a lot of focus, as we've mentioned, on good regulatory practices, meaning, again, transparency, advance notice of new regulations, and the ability to comment. There are significant differences between the Europeans and the U.S. side as to how and where that should be applied. Who gets to comment is a big issue. In most European regulations is not put out to private sector comment. In the U.S., it's Administrative Procedure Act works differently. We put it out to public comment. So that is a big debate. How it's going to apply to states and member states, the regulations that do remain within the province of U.S. states and European member states is also something that is uncertain. Whether or not it will involve impact assessment, which is something we have in the U.S., where we assess the cost benefits of a new regulation, whether or not that will be applied transatlantically is something that is also being considered. There have been proposals for a variety of sector-specific initiatives, particularly in the areas, not surprisingly, that we talked about before: medical devices, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, pesticides, information communication technology, and autos. They are all pursuing different approaches to reducing regulatory differences. In the auto sector, they are looking at mutual recognition. In the pharmaceutical sector and medical devices, they are looking at regulatory cooperation, sharing and inspection reports, doing co-inspections. To give you a sense of this change I'm referring to of mindset of trade officials and regulatory officials needing one another, the FDA has hired somebody in its international programs office whose entire agenda is pursuing trade agreements to achieve offensive interests of more internationally compatible regulation. They have put forward a plan. They actually came to USTR with a list of items that they wanted to result from this negotiation. From merely 5 years ago, that was unthinkable. It was a conversation of why is regulation in a trade agreement. It's been a dramatic change. That said, many of the areas that everyone knows in terms of fights between the European Union and the U.S. remain unresolved. There is no serious thought that this would include genetically modified organisms. There is no serious thought that this would include the provision of hormones to cattle or hormone-treated beef. And there is much debate about whether or not this should include financial services regulation. So there is a long, long way to go, but there are some preliminary signs of progress. This will be a long-term initiative. And that's it. I look forward to your questions.
Muchas gracias, Thomas, por tu sugerente presentación. Y ahora quiero ceder la palabra al profesor Jason Weidner, doctor en Relaciones Internacionales por la Florida International University, maestro en Estudios Internacionales por la Universidad de Chile. Trabaja actualmente sobre temas de globalización y gobernanza global, sobre teoría política y teoría de las relaciones internacionales, sobre economía política global, y actualmente prepara en Routledge un libro sobre Globalizing Governmentality, Sides of Neoliberal Assemblage in the Americas. Quiero dar una bienvenida muy especial a Jason porque, si no entiendo mal, es su primera presentación en el Colegio de México como nuevo investigador de nuestro Centro de Estudios Internacionales. Entonces le doy una bienvenida muy calurosa y le deseo mucho éxito en esta institución a la que da estos pasos bien firmes al lado de personalidades como las que tenemos el día de hoy. Muchas gracias.
Mejor, me cansa mejor.
Muchísimas gracias, Carlos, por el bienvenido y muchas gracias a Celia por la invitación. Y ahora voy a cambiar al inglés. Actually, this is not only my first presentation here in the Colegio de Mexico. I actually just arrived on Monday, so I'm starting up a new position. And it's my first time as a discussant on a panel that's very policy-oriented. So when I got the invitation, and it was not too long ago from Celia to be a discussant on this panel, normally when I've been a discussant, it's at an academic conference, and there are 2 or 3 people in the audience, and I'm just commenting on the papers that I've received, and that's it. And truth be told, I'm not an expert in any of the free trade agreements that are under discussion today. The research that I have done is on a failed free trade agreement, which is a free trade area of the Americas, or ALCA, which I did doctoral research on, and a little bit on CAFTA-DR. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to be brief, because it's been a long day, and this panel coming after the meal, I think it'll be good to keep it short, and I'm sure there's a lot of interesting questions from the audience. But what I'm going to do is, since my interests are more kind of macro-theoretical, involving issues having to deal with globalization and global governance, I'm just going to throw out some reactions to what's been under discussion so far today, and maybe hopefully that'll incite or provoke some discussion. First of all, so in the past 25 years, we've seen this proliferation of free trade agreements. And they have all these acronyms, and they're impossible to remember them all, and some of the acronyms can become weird. And actually, John, you left us wondering, was it CRAP? That was the... Oh, okay. So some less fortunate than others. But so what's going on here? It's tempting to say that some of these are responses to the stalled Doha round and the fact that there hasn't been a lot of progress, and that some of the countries that have been throwing or exercising a little bit more influence, like Brazil and India and so forth, and not going along with what's been suggested by U.S. and EU countries for the most recent round of WTO negotiations. But if you think about it, these free trade agreements have been going on even before the Doha round stalled, so that's not the complete explanation. one term that came up a lot in the panel today was geopolitics. And as an international relations scholar, that's always on my mind, because my focus is always looking at the politics, and politics is always about power and interest. And so it was interesting to hear it said before that the initial FPP was not primarily economically motivated. I think that if you really look at it, most, if not all, the free trade agreements, economics are not usually the first consideration, or if they are, it's hard to separate, to disentangle economic, security, and geopolitical considerations. I mean, if we think about the first post-World War II regional agreements, or really the kind of U.S.-led international order, what Eikenberry calls liberal internationalism 2.0, it was very geopolitically driven. And as John pointed out, the identity of these regions is very fluid. At one point it was Northeast Asia, and that was in the context of the Cold War, the United States thinking of Japan as taking a lead role in that region as being a bulwark against Soviet and communist expansion. So that's one thing that I think is important to keep in mind, are the fact that even though there may be benefits, and I want to kind of leave aside the debate, because I'm not an economist, about the welfare benefits of these free trade agreements. I don't want to come down one way or the other of them. I think that we need to keep in mind that a lot of times these agreements are very geopolitically driven. In another way, I think they're also very ideologically driven in the following sense. I think that what is interesting today is that there's developing a certain degree of common sense agreement. Like, what struck me about the first panel was the degree of agreement amongst the people from the different countries who participated in these free trade agreements. That's not a new phenomenon. I mean, if you look back at earlier Pax Britannica in the 19th century, you can see kind of an international elite that had a sort of international liberalism. So I don't want to overemphasize that, but I do think that it's remarkable the extent how global that is today. How in country after country, if you look at the heads of the economic ministries and the departments and the people who are involved in putting together, negotiating these treaties, not that there is a homogeneity of ideas and so forth, but there is to take up a word that's been used a lot today, convergence to a certain degree of perspectives. Now, that could be a really good thing if what we're moving towards is ultimately beneficial, if the liberalization of trade and so forth. And again, I don't want to come down on the side of whether that's good or not. I'll leave that to people to debate. But what that is ultimately, in a sense, potentially depoliticizing. And that's my interest in global governance, because currently we're in this strange situation globally where we don't have a global state. The nation state is still the locus of political authority. It's where citizens can make claims and hold their representatives and leaders accountable to varying degrees, depending on the country and its political system. That doesn't exist at the global level. And so for the past 20 plus years, we've been creating this kind of patchwork system of global governance, and today we're just looking at one aspect of it, which is trade. There's all these other various aspects as well, considering human rights and a whole range of issues. And it's a really big challenge, and I think we're still in the early stages of figuring out how to deal with that. And that may be okay. It may be that a kind of patchwork ad hoc way that we're proceeding on a planetary scale is maybe the best way, and maybe that's the way that things will ultimately work out the best. What concerns me is the fact that it's another level removed from the political process where people can actually have an input and say and hold people accountable, especially when with these free trade agreements, we're talking about making binding commitments that are very long term, to where that might be the consensus now, but then it becomes difficult, especially for smaller countries that have less leverage, if they want to change their model of social economic development, then they're adopting these constraints that are potentially very limiting in what their future options are. And this leads me to another consideration, and this may sound a little bit strange, but it occurred to me that this idea of convergence, especially talking about regulations, but a whole range of other things in trade, there's kind of the assumption that that's a positive thing. And it may very well be, but the analogy occurred to me as far as we have a kind of, what we're producing is almost a political monocrop. And one of the things that we've recently been learning about the recent financial crisis is that interdependency and interconnection can increase efficiency, but it also increases risks. And so there's a whole range of studies now in systems theory dealing with systems resilience. Now, this is a little bit of a kind of out there idea, but I just want to throw it out. What if actually the best way to proceed is by allowing a little more room for experimentation and thereby building in a little bit more resilience into our global economic system, instead of assuming that there's kind of one model that is the best model that will increase efficiency and focus on convergence. Again, not that I'm necessarily convinced that that's the case, but I think it's something worth considering. And I mean, just one last consideration too is, I think it's easy to, when you get into this kind of discussion and people whose focus is really on very specific issues that are extremely complex and have a lot of details, we can lose the perspective of how this links to other aspects, for example, of the global economy. It was mentioned a little bit about possibility of financial regulation. That's one area where we actually have a real deficit in rules in global governance. So in the area of trade, we have an increasingly robust, still not as much as maybe some people would like, but if you think about in global governance, that's where we have the most robust set of rules that countries are committed to and have enforcement mechanisms. In the global economy, in the area of finance and financial regulation, which was really, one of the, if not the key factors for the recent crisis that we're still kind of experiencing in the aftermath, that's an area that's really underdeveloped. So I think it's important to keep in mind the linkages between the different areas of economic governance and think about how we can have a more kind of holistic, comprehensive way of thinking about these issues. Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Jason, por tus comentarios. Y ahora pasamos la palabra al público. Tenemos unos 20 minutos para discutir, ¿o cuánto? ¿15 minutos? 5 minutos nada más. Bueno, está abierta el micrófono. Usted y usted, por favor.
Hola, buenas tardes. Me gustaría saber su perspectiva respecto a el TPP. Si para México dependemos altamente de las exportaciones hacia Estados Unidos. Japón está incluido en el TPP, sin embargo, también tenemos pues un tratado de libre comercio con Japón. La entrada del TPP abriría, digamos, como nuevas oportunidades para el comercio con este país. Y la segunda pregunta es si entre el tratado, si podría haber repercusiones derivado de la aprobación del tratado entre la Unión Europea y Estados Unidos, puesto que para las importaciones y exportaciones entre estos dos países se utiliza mucho como plataforma en nuestro país. Gracias.
¿Quieren contestar? Would you like to respond right now? Or? We take them all. Okay, tomamos varias preguntas o intervenciones. El señor John Weeks.
Thank you very much. I must say I've very much enjoyed all three presentations and the commentary as well. I think it's made me, I've learned something, and it's made me think about some things from a different perspective, so thank you. Now my question is for Thomas Bollock, and it's on this it's really a general question. If this effort is successful at producing a regulatory agreement between Europe and the United States, I mean, clearly it is very important and would be a new development. I've been saying for about 20 years that I thought the next big thing in international trade was going to be regulation, and so far I've been wrong, but it would appear it may be happening. What do you see as being the effect of this in terms of what will happen in other agreements? Let me say, you know, when you look at regional trade agreements that are based essentially on eliminating tariffs, it's quite easy through other agreements by eliminating tariffs to sort of catch up and have once again an integrated trading system. But when you're talking about regulations, it's sort of a different kettle of fish. You can build up different regulatory systems and different agreements, and they can be sort of completely insulated from each other, isolated from each other, or at least it would seem that to me. Do you think this is a risk? And if so, what might be done to try to guard against that?
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta que quisieran hacer? Por favor.
Yo muy rápida, Carlos, perdón. Supongamos que se llega a buen término con TPP y con TTIP. Es poco probable, pero vamos a suponer que se firman los dos acuerdos. ¿Dónde queda China? Es una parte fundamental del comercio mundial. ¿Bajo qué términos se regiría el intercambio de China con el mundo?
¿Se podría presentar, por favor?
Claro. Anabel Boisonade, de la Delegación de la Unión Europea, aquí en México. Dr. Ravenhill, so you made a comparison about RCEP being a possible alternative to TPP and demonstrating mostly its weaknesses, etc. How about the lines of the Pacific as an alternative, as it was mentioned this morning as a possibility, since it's very Asia-oriented? I mean, for initial members, as a first step, integrating themselves better, although they each have FTAs between themselves. But the ultimate goal of this initiative is to, is to increase trade with Asia. So how about this project as an alternative? Do you see it viable, or do you see this as lots of optimism because it's very pragmatic and it's an easy negotiation compared to the TPP, but what is the possible future? Thanks.
Por favor.
Jeffrey Schott, I have a question for John Ravenhill. I was curious about your rosy projections for RCEP. Actually astounded. And I wanted you to elaborate further with the particular reference to the participation by India. Because any near-term projection of RCEP negotiations that I have heard have been much more pessimistic because of the at least near-term projection of Indian trade policy and protectionism. And indeed, it has led China to depreciate or devalue its view of RCEP because it felt that India would be a foot dragger and slow the process of integration, even for the very modest ambitions that the RCEP countries have for their arrangement. So I wonder if you could comment on that, or if you think that that's going to be exaggerated after the Indian election, everything will be fine.
Gustavo Vega tiene deseos de tomar la palabra.
Yo tendría una pregunta para Tomás. Uno sabe que normalmente el tema de las armonización o de regulaciones se involucran mucho los sectores privados, las propias industrias discuten. Creo que por ejemplo en NAFTA se logró una regla común de origen en cuestiones de computadoras porque los propios sectores, las empresas se pusieron de acuerdo y eliminaron muchos elementos que creaban distorsión. Entonces, entonces la gran pregunta es, en las discusiones que habrá, ¿en qué medida se involucrarán o de algún modo habrá una representación del sector privado a nivel industrial en estos sectores that you were mentioning, que pudieran ayudar a avanzar en el proceso de armonización de las regulaciones? Porque a final de cuentas son regulaciones que deben de aceptar también las industrias y los sectores privados, y no es algo que se puede imponer desde arriba. En ciertos casos sí, pero digamos de algún modo siempre hay un proceso de consulta. ¿En qué medida se está avanzando en eso, o se ha avanzado, que permita asumir que ya hay un proceso de avance, que lo único que requiere es que los gobiernos se pongan de acuerdo en algo que ya se negoció a nivel industrial, de las propias industrias, o esto está por hacerse en el proceso, lo cual sin duda complicará más todavía el acuerdo, ¿no? El acuerdo en el caso del TTIP.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, si no hay más, entonces voy a ceder la palabra a los ponentes en el mismo orden en el que la tomaron en sus exposiciones. Entonces tiene la palabra Meredith.
Maybe this one might be easier.
El jarrito. Gracias.
Thank you. Before I address the question about Mexico and Japan, I wanted to just follow up on something that Jason said about agreements being politically motivated versus economically motivated. And I wanted to sort of, I guess, clarify what I said in my remarks, which is that I think the P4 countries were economically motivated from the standpoint that they wanted the FTAP to happen. They wanted to have this bigger FTA to happen. And from that standpoint, they thought doing the P4 was a good way to get it started. But if we just look at the P4 itself, that was not for the purposes of trade between the P4 countries, right? And I think similarly, when we assess the potential gains for, let's say, Mexico from the TPP, potential gains aren't just the 11 partners today. It's who's going to come in the future. From that standpoint, I think Mexico and Canada have been very wise to come in, because you're not just getting the new linkages that exist now, but you're going to get all those other Asian countries that are going to come in later. And that leads me into my response to the question about Mexico and Japan. Of course, Mexico and Japan already have an FTA, but there are deeper or shallower FTAs, right? So presumably, the TPP will be more comprehensive than the Mexico-Japan FTA. However, there has been an issue in these negotiations whether there will be unified market access schedules or whether pre-existing FTAs will remain those terms as between those partners, in which case, if that were the approach, perhaps there would be no new market access between Mexico and Japan. My understanding is it will be a unified approach, but I don't know that for sure. If it is a unified approach, then probably there will be more market access for Mexico than under the Mexico-Japan FTA. But I think another benefit for Mexico with respect to Japan is the eventual inclusion of other Asian countries, because Japan's supply chains involve a lot of Asian countries and may not present so many opportunities for Mexican companies. But if those other countries are linked in as well, then it may be easier to include Mexico in those supply chains.
Muchas gracias. John,
Right.
tiene la palabra.
Okay, thank you. Some excellent questions, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to any of them, I fear. On opportunities with Japan, I'd like to try to address this from the domestic politics point of view. Reformers in Japan, reformers in China as well, want to use these trade agreements, TPP in Japan's case, to promote their reformist agenda. There are very significant domestic obstacles to doing this. In Japan, of course, agricultural interests are overrepresented in the Diet. The configuration of bureaucracy in Japan is really not very helpful. Over the years, there have been efforts to try to centralize more authority in the office of the Prime Minister on trade negotiations. This really hasn't gone very far. Korea has been much more successful in doing this up to now. Korea has also been much more successful in putting into place a package of compensation for interests adversely affected by FTAs, especially in agriculture. So I think that even though the current administration in Japan is clearly committed to a reformist agenda, I'm not sure that the configurations are all that favorable, and whether the current government would survive an agreement that made a great deal of concessions on agricultural issues, I think is very much an open question. Where is China if the TPP is signed? I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference to China. People are going to invest in China for the same reasons they're investing in China now.
The domestic market.
Domestic market, yeah. Production networks. I mean, it's sometimes forgotten that East Asia is as integrated as North America if one takes the common measure of this, that is the share of intra-regional trade as a percentage of total trade. I mean, it's very similar in East Asia as in NAFTA. And this, is without any region-wide trade agreement. Now, there are all sorts of issues that come into play here because, of course, a lot of the exchange is in components in East Asia, and so there's a significant amount of double counting that goes on in this. But nonetheless, the aggregate data are very similar. East Asia is quite remarkably integrated, and China, of course, has become the center of these networks. Most of these components already move around the region duty-free because of the information technology agreement and various other arrangements, domestic duty drawback arrangements for components. So I don't think in terms of merchandise trade it's going to make very much difference, and indeed was pointed out this morning, tariffs of 3% or so. Sorry? Rules of origin, yeah. Yep. It may affect China, yeah. I mean, I was again to engage in some sort of crystal ball gazing. I mean, I think a potential beneficiary would be Vietnam from this. Vietnam may attract some of the investment, as it is already doing, in fact, that previously was going into China. Wage rates are lower there than on the coast in China, so I think that might be a factor. Where this would leave reformers in China, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. Will it spur reform in China to make China a possible later accession to the TPP? Or will it, in fact, lead to a backlash in China? And I think it could go either way. And I'm not 100% certain that the relaxed attitude, well, this will push China to reform, will in fact carry the day. On alternatives to TPP, for Asia, if it's going to be an alternative to TPP, it has to be China-led. And I think that's going to be the most important conditioning factor there. So if China is not in the driving seat, then it's going to be something that maybe has some small positive gains, but nothing all that important. This is a real achievement for me this afternoon. This is the very first time that Jeff has ever accused me of being more optimistic on any trade agreement than he is. So I've done something this afternoon. I was trying to after being critical of ASEAN and RCEP, I was trying to be a little bit more upbeat at the end. I mean, I agree, India...
Nothing is easy.
Yeah, that's right. India is a problem. I mean, it would be interesting, coming back to the EU, if the EU-India agreement goes ahead, and the EU is able to push India into a more comprehensive agreement than it's managed to negotiate up to now, that might be a very useful precedent on which the RCEP could build. But like Jeff, I wouldn't be holding my breath on that one either, I think. So if you have a large economy essentially saying all that we want is a poor quality agreement, the question then is whether Japan, Korea, and China say, okay, now we'll take this because it's of symbolic importance. And that may be the outcome. And I don't think that New Zealand or Australia, which are obviously pushing for a higher quality agreement, would in the end stand in the way on this. I mean, the current Australian government has said, we want trade agreements. And seems to be quite relaxed about whether or not they're going to get what they originally started off asking for on these agreements. Okay.
Muchas gracias, John. Bueno, es ahora el turno de Thomas Bollyky.
Great. I think I had three questions. To start with on the regulation and what this move in trade might mean, particularly vis-a-vis the Europe-US agreement. I will say I think this is an important part, or what effect it might have on third countries. I think when you have large economies like the US and Europe agreeing on a particular regulatory approach, it will propagate. In the same way that a lot of tariff liberalization happened unilaterally, you'll see a lot of unilateral adoption of similar regulatory approaches without having to have an agreement, because the combined economic pull of those countries is so significant. Now, if you have this focus, and I quite frankly, I don't think you'll see progress unless you see this focus of this overlapping interest between trade and regulation. In many ways, that will be a good thing, because by and large, US and Europe have reasonably high standards and things. They can be predictable. Moving to that basis presumably will result in better health and environmental outcomes to a degree. There will be transition costs. And how you adapt for those transition costs really depends. A question that a lot of people have is if, for instance, you see a lot of regulatory convergence in the agricultural space, that has enormous implications for Africa vis-a-vis the European export market. So there will be adaptations that need to be made, particularly for smallholders in that case, and there may be in other contexts as well, but there will be transition costs, but you will see this unilateral effect. On Celia's good question on China, I have to admit I've got to tell this story a little bit because I differ a bit on the what led to TPP in 2007. I was at USTR at the time, and I covered Australia and New Zealand. My boss was Barbara Wiesel, and I think it's important because Barbara deserves a lot of credit for what has happened in TPP. TPP in its initial origins had, in my view, or at least in terms of our conversations, nothing to do with China. It had to do with how to move forward negotiations with small countries. The U.S.-Thailand trade discussions had stalled, U.S.-Malaysia had stalled. You had New Zealand had been asking for a trade agreement for God knows how long, which you mentioned. Taiwan, other governments that were within the Southeast Asian region looking to move similarly, and there was, this was seen as a way of moving forward. Barbara saw the P4. I and several other people on her staff, together with her, researched whether or not it would be similar to U.S. trade agreements. She floated it into a meeting and then sold the leadership on it. It was absolutely remarkable. She deserves an enormous amount of credit for how that has moved forward. Now, whether or not in 2010, when the Obama administration relaunched it, how much it had to do with China is an entirely different calculation, and it may very much have to do with a pivot to Asia and containing China, but I think it's I want to make sure I give adequate credit to Barbara and also to what a remarkable environment USTR can be, that a single official can do something like that. It's something to behold. Now, what will be the consequences of China being excluded in this case? I actually think they, for the reasons that Jaime suggested, may start to become more significant. I don't foresee China, given the U.S. domestic political environment. Whether China can adopt these standards is a different question. I see zero prospect of China being able to accede to this agreement from U.S. domestic politics in the short term, short and medium term. We can't even do a sale of a pork producer to China in the U.S. without massive controversy. I cannot imagine what unholy hell would be unleashed by having China seek to accede to this agreement from a U.S. congressional context. It would be something. I do not see that happening in the short and medium term. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see it happening. It being excluded from these two agreements, I mean, you saw the regulatory barriers China has are significant. They have rising labor costs. They have demographic challenges. I think it starts to have an effect. How much of an effect? We'll see. But I do think it's not de minimis. On the issue of what is industry's role in these conversations on these regulatory negotiations, I'll take that make sure I cover your question. I'll answer in different ways. The first is, in the current negotiations, there's been heavily industry involvement. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is all over this, as is its counterpart in Europe. There have been, really the areas that have been focused on in these negotiations have been areas where transatlantically there's a lot of interest on the business community to seeing something happen. So there's been a lot of business input in what the negotiation agenda might look like. Whether that means you end up succeeding or those are what's included, who knows, but there's been a lot of input. Moving forward, that's actually one of the big topics of debate, which is if you build in these good regulatory practices, this transparency, this advance notice, the ability to comment, again, who gets to comment? In the US system under the Administrative Procedures Act, you have public comment, which includes industry. Europe has a different system and they don't have as much private consultation. The US, one of its early objectives have been to try to have the Europeans move to a system where they have more private sector comment on these regulations. So that is one of these areas. One of the last is that they're looking now into what infrastructure do you build around to support these regulatory talks. I think you're going to see only a few areas where an actual regulatory convergence is concluded in these negotiations. There will be a few to show that something can happen and to have an immediate payoff, but in many areas it will be a work plan. It will be structures set up to move this forward, commitments by both regulatory authorities to move those conversations, and a supporting architecture. How that engages the business community as it moves forward, as well as civil society, I think is something that nobody has any idea yet, but it will need to for support to be in place.
Bueno, quiero agradecer muy sinceramente a todos los participantes en esta mesa por sus ponencias, por los comentarios, por las respuestas. Y ahora quiero solicitar la presencia aquí en este estrado de Celia Toro para que nos dirija unas palabras en razón de que Herminio Blanco, que estaba previsto clausurar este evento, no va a estar aquí y entonces ella nos dirá algo.
Nada que decir más que darles las gracias. a los panelistas, desde luego, a ustedes por su paciencia, agradecerles a José Luis y a Erika, a Jean-François Prudhomme, a Ana Covarrubias por su apoyo en este seminario de hoy, al público por su paciencia. Fue un día muy largo, pero no había manera de hacerlo en dos, digamos. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes y ojalá, espero verlos pronto por aquí en el próximo seminario. Gracias a todos.